Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be taking a look back at a classic JRE episode, number 1282, with Adam Conover. This is probably one of Joe's most disliked podcasts, but it's one of those things where it's so bad it's actually entertaining. I mean, this guy Adam, he did not know what he got himself into, and it's like he's never had a conversation before where somebody's actually disagreed with him because he was not prepared for somebody to question what he was saying, and I don't think he's thought through 90% of the stuff he's talking about, so it did not go very well for him. So I'm pretty surprised he'd even go on the podcast. I'll give him credit for that, I guess. But I don't even know if he really knew what the podcast is like, because if you try telling Joe Rogan one of the main reasons men are better at sports than women is just because men created the sports, you better expect some pushback, which I don't know if he's prepared for, because all it took was one question from Joe and his whole argument fell apart.
In sports, one of the things, our assumption that men have an advantage over women. Right, in sports. In sports, yeah.
Our assumption?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let me expand on it. Our assumption that men have an advantage over women in sports is partially based on the fact that so many of the sports were designed for male bodies. Right, they're optimized for male bodies. Right, basketball, for example. Right.
How is that optimized for male bodies?
It's like the height of the basket, the way that the ball moves around, like
the ball moves around.
If we're gonna say that, if we're gonna say that,
I mean, did he really expect Joe not to question this? Honestly, somebody needed to. Clearly, the people around him are not doing the job, and they're just agreeing with all this nonsense because, I mean, all it took was one question. How is basketball designed for males? And his response was hilarious. The height of the hoop, any height that hoop is at, men are going to be dominating. And then also the way the ball moves around. I don't even know what he means by that, and he clearly doesn't either. He started laughing right after he said it. Hopefully he realized how ridiculous it sounded right after he said it, but it doesn't look like it, because last year he went on Hassan's live stream and he was talking about this podcast and he was just doubling down on it, and he sounded just as ridiculous as he did back then. And even Hassan was pushing back on it a little bit in like the most polite way possible. You could tell he didn't really want to get into an argument. But I think he even realized how ridiculous Adam sounded here.
The entire system of male versus female sports is prejudiced, and we should demolish the whole thing and come up with a system of sports that everybody can participate in, because sports are just a part of life.
People will say that that's like discriminatory towards women, though, because then it's like, because all men will always dominate. Men will always dominate that co-ed sport.
They
because
won't
like
if you
because of the
sports.
averages. Because of like I get it. I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Take soccer, right? How would you adjust the rules of soccer very slightly in order to make it, build more gender parity into soccer? You could do it. We made the sports up.
I know, but there's no. I know, but there's so much there's so much tradition that people will refuse to do that. They'll say you're trying to game the system in a way that it's worse. The outcomes are worse overall because co-ed automatically means worse, because as it stands currently, co-ed is worse.
And he sounds like somebody that knows nothing about sports. If he honestly thinks you just change a rule slightly and then all of a sudden men and women are going to be equal in soccer and basketball, and his reasoning for this is always just, we invented sports and men invented sports, so that means they're better. That's the only reason they're better. I mean, who believes that?
And I try to get him to look at it with a bigger picture and say hey man, sports are social constructions. We made them up. We designed sports such that the most popular ones are designed for a male body. What if we didn't do that? What if women's gymnastics, men can't do that shit, right? Because there's etc. What if we invented sports that we did not have a problem with, right? Because sports is just a fun thing to do. Sports is something that everyone should be able to participate in. So what if we invented some less gendered sports? He was not willing to entertain that conversation. He was I was like, is this not interesting? And he wouldn't go there with me.
And nobody's stopping you from creating a new sport. If he really thinks there's a sport out there where men and women could be equal and it'd be competitive and entertaining, then go ahead and start it. But it's insane to think that basketball and soccer, billion-dollar industries, should start experimenting with their rules so they can try to make men and women equal so they can start playing together. That will ever happen. And I don't think female athletes are even arguing for that. Obviously they want to get paid more, and some of them once in a while be like, yeah, I could be an NBA player. But in reality, if you're hey, you got to go out tomorrow night and guard LeBron James, I don't know if they're interested in that. And of course, one of the reasons Adam is making this argument is because he wants trans people, trans women in particular, to be able to compete with biological women. And of course, Joe is completely against that. And he goes on this whole rant about how unfair it is and why it's unfair. And then at the end of it, Adam's just like, yeah, I disagree with that. And Joe's like, what do you disagree with? He's like, well, listen, I'm not an expert on this subject. And you're going to be hearing that a lot. He says that probably 20 times throughout this podcast. It seems like whenever he gets cornered, he's like, well, I'm not an expert on this. I didn't know if you're aware of that. It's like, yeah, I think we could tell once you start talking about how the only reason men are better at basketball is because the way the ball moves around.
So if you're a woman and you're a natural woman and you don't take any extra hormones or male hormones, you're not taking steroids or any sort of performance-enhancing drugs, you're doing your very best to compete and you're at the top of the heap. But then someone comes along that was a man for 30 years and decides that they're going to be a woman, and this has happened, and literally transitioned a few months ago, and competes as a woman and destroys records and dominates you in that sport. That's bullshit. And that's not competing on a level playing field. That's a person who's biologically a male and who is a male for 30 plus years of having testosterone run through their body and affect their tendon strength and affect the shape of their bones and the mechanical advantages of the male hips versus the female hips. And then they're competing with smaller people who have been a woman their whole life. It's not fair. It's as much cheating as taking steroids when the other person doesn't, or taking performance-enhancing drugs when the other person doesn't, maybe even more so. Maybe even more so because you also there's a bunch of advantages in terms of reaction time that males enjoy. It's some significant difference in reaction time between males and even untrained males versus female professional athletes.
Well, I disagree, and
what do you disagree about?
I've already my main point being the one that I already made, right? That I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfectly level playing field. I think we decide what kind of playing field we want to have.
Sure, but we do make the distinction where we don't allow men to compete in women's divisions.
And I think that distinction may be breaking down a bit, right? And I think it may be time to break down that distinction a little bit.
So you think that males should be able to compete in the women's division of weightlifting?
No, I don't necessarily.
But they can if they transition.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of stuff to break down, right? And I'm not an expert on the subject, right? So it's just sort of off the top of my head.
And him saying he's not an expert on the situation is basically just saying, I'm not trans and we should talk to a trans person about this. He makes it sound like only trans people should be able to give their opinions on these topics because they're the most affected by it. But if you're talking about sports, then female athletes are obviously going to be really affected by this. So you should probably listen to what they have to say. And I'm not an expert, I'm not claiming to be an expert here, but I would imagine most of them probably really aren't that into the idea of somebody transitioning and then coming into their sport and dominating it. They could lose out on winning a championship. They could lose out on a scholarship. They could lose out on a job. If a trans person joins the WNBA, they're obviously going to be taking away a spot from somebody. And I don't know if women want to be competing with somebody that was born a man who could be like some 7-foot tall person that transitioned later in life and then they join the WNBA and they're just dominating and dunking on people. And I guess it would make it more entertaining for the league, but then eventually it'll just be dominated by trans people. So I don't know if they really want to go down that route, but I don't know. Maybe we should consult with the experts. One of Adam's 10,000 trans friends, it's hilarious how much he brings this up. Like every 10 minutes he says, I'm not an expert, but I have a trans friend I could talk to about this. Like he sounds like Rick from Pawn Stars if all his experts were trans people.
Again, I'm not an expert on this, and I'd love to. This is the kind of topic where I really want to make sure that I know the research and that I'm, also speaking to trans folks, in this conversation. But so to touch on just what I have a friend who has a trans kid. Don't know the kid's exact age, but we're in the age range that we're talking about. And he's explained that my child from a very young age consistently said, I am a girl. And has never contradicted themselves, never changed their mind. And so the humane thing and the thing that he felt was good to do as a parent was to embrace that choice on his child's part, right?
But if that's who they are, if they think that they're a girl, why do you have to give them hormones to make them more of a girl?
Because I'm sorry, can you expand on the question?
It's a simple question. If you say that the child thinks it's a girl, so you're going to give the child hormones
So what trans people express, and again, I'm not an expert. This is from me talking to my trans friends and seeing what other trans folks say. Look, so all I can do is defer to the experts that I know about this, right? So, for instance, there's an author named Bryn Tannehill, who's a former military helicopter pilot. I just interviewed her for my new podcast. So look, I know quite a few trans folks, right? Mm-hmm. I do know also among the trans folks that I know are the trans people who speak about this that I've heard. I'm very curious, and this is what I'd go consult my friend or my recent interview subject, Bryn Tannehill's work on this to see how many. But I would really I've sort of reached the limit of like my facility with this topic. Mm-hmm. I really want to shout out videos made by a friend of mine. Her videos are called ContraPoints. Her name's Natalie Wynn, and she does these. She's a former philosopher, former philosophy PhD, mm-hmm. and she does these incredibly funny videos. When we're talking about an issue that affects those people, right? The first thing we should do is listen to those people. When we talk to the actual trans folks, right, and talk to, say, hey, what do you think? How do you feel?
But we also have a different conversation. We talk to people that have regret from transition surgery, because there's a lot of those.
Sure, but we don't have either of those folks in the room.
Right, but we have to acknowledge that they're real as well.
Look, the last conversation I had with a person about this was a trans military veteran who mm-hmm. is a researcher who wrote a book on these issues, right? Comprehensively looked at the research and told me that the research shows that the evidence that you're asking for exists, maybe not on a 30-year timeline, but there have been studies of this, and here's what we know about them, right?
About children transitioning?
Yeah, I mean, that is my understanding of I have not looked at the research myself. Including those folks in this conversation is a really critical part of it for me.
Sure.
So yeah.
10 million. I mean, how many people are trans? What's the numbers on that?
I don't know, but I would consult my friend Bryn's book to find out, because I'm sure it's in there, because she wrote a book that breaks down all these statistics called
"This is such
Everything You Need to Know About Trans."
Minefield of a subject,
and I'm not an expert on that, and I don't want to claim to be, right?
Yeah, so he was just stuck in this loop, and most of the podcast he just sounded so confused.
Way more women involved in gymnastics than men.
Oh, absolutely. But those are the sports that get the less attention, right?
Gymnastics
and we have
gets huge amounts of attention.
It sure does. It's one of the rare examples of
And he couldn't find any topic that Joe would agree with him on. And it's so funny because he'd start talking about something. He's like, you'd have to be an idiot to believe this. And Joe's like, well, actually, I believe that, and I think you're completely wrong about this. Like at one point, they're talking about that amputee runner who killed his girlfriend, Oscar Pistorius. And Adam's like, can you believe people actually think that his prosthetic leg helped him in any way? And Joe's like, well, I think it did.
And people were saying about this guy that his prosthetic gave him an advantage. Now, first of all, there's no fucking way that's true, because he doesn't have muscles. Muscles
but
convert
I actually
food
think
into.
It does give you an advantage. I mean,
you do think so?
I think mechanically it does, because they're springs. They essentially, the way his leg works with those things.
Hold on a second. That's not an advantage, because how mechanics work, right, is that a spring, you put energy into it and you get a little bit less energy out, right? So because that's the laws of thermodynamics, right? You can't get more out than you put in.
But at least this is a subject where he doesn't need to talk about consulting one of his trans experts again. But, obviously the trans stuff is going to be the most divisive topic. That's where they had the most disagreements. And then at the end of the episode, is so funny. He started talking about the moon landing, because I guess on his TV show, he did a whole episode on that, about how there's no way it could have been faked. And he starts giving reasons why. And immediately Joe's like, well, that's one of the reasons why people say it's fake. And he's like, I used to be a total denier. I thought for sure it was fake. And Adam's just like, oh man, I shouldn't have brought this up, because they already had so many disagreements, and obviously it was not going well for Adam. So by the end of this, I think he was just defeated.
Oh, this is one of my favorite videos we ever did. So, it's about how the moon land. The thesis is the moon landing could not have been faked. It would have been harder to fake the moon landing than it would have been to actually go to the moon, because the technology to fake it did not exist. And we talked to a forensic film guy, and he walked us through it. He's like, look, the shadows are parallel, right? They're not diverging. A close light source, the shadows would diverge, right?
Wait a minute. That's like one of the big arguments for the moon hoax, Is it the shadows intersect? The shadows indicate multiple light sources?
Well, that is because when
but that's one of the main arguments.
That is I believe that's reflected light. Okay, I'm getting past my memory of this segment.
Yeah, dude, I used to be a full-on moon hoaxer. I fully believed we never went to the moon.
I shouldn't have brought this up.
I watched the documentary that was on Fox TV while I was on news radio. It was like,
yeah, so they had a lot of disagreements throughout the podcast, but it never really got heated at all. Joe had a lot of patience with this guy. Like, the most annoyed Joe would get would be when Adam would say something ridiculous, and then Joe would be like, what are you saying, dude? Let me explain to you how that makes no sense.
Most of the games that we've constructed are actually sort of biased towards a male type of body, right?
That sounds ridiculous. First of all, the reason why...
So then, like I said, a few years after this, Adam went on Hassan's live stream, and Hassan brought up the podcast, and they started talking about it.
I was excited to do this interview because at the time, Joe was not so directly associated with like the far right. Like, he hadn't totally made that turn yet. All right, I mean, I'll go to bat for what I think is right here as best I can. But, you know, when the dude is like locked and loaded with like, you know, Jamie pull that up shit of whatever pseudoscience he wants to bring up, it wasn't the best position to be in. And, you know, so that's my biggest bummer about it was like, he was not really into the idea of having like an honest, he turned it immediately into a boxing match, and I wanted to have a conversation. So all the backlash was like, oh, Rogan owned you. He won a debate against you. I was like, I thought I was having a conversation. Like, yeah. I thought I went on to just like talk about my show, and he turned it into a fist fight, which that's what I don't like about it.
Yeah, so maybe he really just didn't know what the podcast was like, or he's just coping. You know, I think it's just a combination of both. But I think if he knew what the podcast was like, he probably wouldn't have gone on there. And also, he's saying Joe went far right afterwards, but Joe had already been associating with a lot of people on the far right. I think maybe he toned it down a little bit. Like, before Adam was on there, he already had on Steven Crowder a bunch of times, Miley Yiannopoulos, Alex Jones, and Stefan Molyneux, like all those kinds of people. And also, if you're familiar with Joe's podcast at all, you should have a pretty good idea of what he thinks about trans people competing in women's sports and kids transitioning at a young age and all that stuff. And it's funny, Adam's like, I thought I was just going to go on there and talk about my TV show, which they did talk about quite a bit, and that still led to arguments. Like, at the beginning of the podcast, Adam brought up an episode from his show where they talk about alphas and betas, and he said that's not a real thing and women aren't attracted to like one over the other. And of course, Joe completely disagreed with that. But again, the argument never really got that intense. It's not like they're yelling at each other or anything. But of course, Adam, he describes it as a boxing match, and he makes it sound like it was this serious debate that he didn't want to get into at all. Even though if he didn't want to get into an argument, he probably shouldn't have gone into his theories about sports. I mean, Joe Rogan is the last person you want to bring that stuff up to, especially if you barely even thought it through. So I don't know why he went into that, and I don't know how he expected Joe to just let that slide and not question it at all. And then once he brought it up, he couldn't really go into it because he hasn't consulted with the experts yet. So I mean, this whole thing was just hilarious. But let me know what you guys think about it down in the comments. And then make sure you go check out my Patreon account. I have a bunch of videos up there, probably over 20 at this point. Most of them are pretty long. And I just posted one about Kramer's infamous meltdown at the Laugh Factory. That's a wild story, so make sure you go check that out. I'll put the link in the description. And then make sure you hit the like button here, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.